from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
As we continue our study in the book of Acts, I invite you to open your Bibles to Acts chapter 27 as we continue this voyage of the Apostle Paul from Caesarea to Rome. Now we continue with verse 27, as we, in our previous lesson, left the Apostle Paul. He was in a storm, in fact, a typhoon, a devil's storm that has swept them across the Mediterranean. As we considered the map, we were reminded that they had gotten to Fair Havens in Crete. They were trying to get to Phoenix. It's a much better harbor for the winter. They got a little wind from the south, and they thought this will do. That would certainly make it easy to run from Fair Havens over to Phoenix. That's an easy quartering or downwind drift into a much better harbor. Paul had told them, based on his experience, remember, he's been shipwrecked already 3 times, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 25. He said, I don't think we ought to travel. The season is already late. They're going to move from the dangerous to the normally canceled season because of the northeasterly winds that blow during the winter storms. They decided to go ahead and go just about 40 miles. It would be better to get to a better harbor, they thought. But the storm, the northeastern storm, caught them and began to blow them to the south. As they got by this small little island of Cauda, they got enough flat water. They were trailing the ship's boat, the smaller boat they would use to run back and forth to the wharf in the harbor. They were able to get enough smooth water because the boat's really going to be pitching wildly and rolling about. And, you know, if you're in the stern of the boat and you're trying to get the smaller boat lifted up, if you're in the stern of the ship, as it rides a wave, the stern may come out of the water a number of feet, anywhere from 10 to 30 feet, depending on, of course, the wave height. And then all of a sudden it can come crashing back down to the surface or even below the surface if the waves are beginning to break over the stern. And so that means that target, that little boat, is coming and going 20 feet, 50 feet with a lot of force, a great way to get smashed into or smashed by that small boat. So they get to some slack water. That little very short island gives them not really a wind shadow, probably as much as a wave shadow. It'll be a flat spot. Wind is still going to be howling. But that gives them time to get the boat to them, get it hoisted up, get it tucked away, and now they can continue. However, as the storm continues to blow them from the northeast to the south, this is the danger zone. They don't have a lot of room here. They can't just run relentlessly or endlessly before the storm because of the shallow. Besides of the shoreline here in the Bay of Syrtis, you have a number of different shallow places in terms of sandbars. We looked at I think it's called a bathoscopic or bathospheric. Anyway, it's a map about how deep the water is. And as you can see by these colors, where they come off of Crete, they're in the deep water. This is somewhere around 4,500 feet deep, way too deep to be putting out a traditional anchor and try to ride it out. They're just going to be blown or drift by the storm. But as you can see, all these shallow areas, there are sandbars out here that's going to create not only the danger of the ship hitting, but even of the waves becoming more fierce in the shallow water as all that wave energy is stacked up in the shallow water. If you're out in the middle of the ocean and a tsunami wave goes across, if you're out in the middle, you probably won't even recognize the wave. It might be slightly different, but it won't be monstrous because most of the wave energy is below the surface, sort of like only the tip of the iceberg is above the surface. The same is true of wave energy. But as it moves up to shallow water, the bottom is going to force that energy to begin to go up because it can't remain submerged, and that's why the waves will stack up whenever you get close to a beach or shallow water. So all of those dangers are here, so they can't just run south, and so that's why they put out the sea anchor. And with the sea anchor out and a foresail, a small foresail, they would be able to drive toward the west. Because otherwise, what's interesting is if they're blown by a northerly wind, how do they end up? All the way across nearly half the Mediterranean, it seems, to the west. How do they get west from a wind out of the north? Well, they do that on purpose. These are experienced and professional sailormen, and they're trying to survive. They've already put the ropes around the cables around the ship to hold it together to try to keep those horizontal longitudinal planks from twisting and popping open a seam and water rushing in and sinking the ship. So they've already done that. And now they're trying to bear off to the west. And it's interesting that Luke uses the words, and so they were driven, because they're not drifting. They are under a very little amount of power, just a little bit of sail that's allowing them to move toward the west rather than just haplessly be drifting to the south into tragedy. However, as we continue now in verse 27, this goes on for 14 days, 2 weeks. For 14 days, Luke says, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea. So again, they're not drifting, they're being driven. There's a small difference there in the idea. Well, so after 14 days, they have not been able to see the sun. They've not been able to see the stars, which means they don't have any fix in terms of their navigation. Where are they in the Mediterranean? How far west are they? How much ground have they covered? There's just absolutely no way to know. So after 14 days of this nonstop, this is a treacherous storm. This is truly a devil storm. This is a typhoon, a raging storm for 2 solid weeks. And then Luke says, and about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. How do they know that? They can't see. The visibility is not going to be good. It's at midnight anyway, so it's dark. Well, a couple of things. The first thing they'll do in verse 28, they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little farther they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. A fathom is 6 feet, so that means in their first measurement they've got 120 feet of depth. Now, generally, if you're in a pool, that's a lot of water. But remember, they've been out in the middle of the Mediterranean where it's more like 4,500 feet, 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet, depending on exactly where they are. So it might as well be bottomless from their perspective. They have no way to reach anything with that kind of depth. And so if you're thinking you're out in the middle of the great big ocean, then all of a sudden this is serious if you're seeing shallow water. 120 feet is very shallow if you should be in, or if you have been in, 4,000, 3,000 feet of water. Not only is that something that is important to notice, but even more important is they go from 20 fathoms and then a little bit later 15 fathoms. So that means they're shallowing up and fairly rapidly. The ship's not going to be doing a whole lot of speed, so to get that kind of change means the bottom's coming up fast. So how is it that they know that the land is approaching? They're not going to be able to see it at midnight. Well, a couple of things are going to be happening. As they get into the shallower water, the waves are going to change. The nature of the waves going to change. Out in the middle of the sea, out in the open water, out in the depths, the waves are going to be more rounded, further spaced apart. Than waves that'll be in shorter. So as they move into shallow water, and as that wave energy is starting to be stacked upwards, as we discussed a moment ago, then the formation of the waves are going to change. They're going to start getting taller, steeper, closer together, which also means the sound would change. So you're less likely to have, or it'll be different, the cresting wave sound out in those bigger more sloped wave tops, but as you come into a steeper, taller wave, then the crest, the waves breaking, will have a different sound, especially to an experienced ear. But it is interesting how Luke writes this. As I read a moment ago, it says, last of verse 27, that they were approaching some land. Literally, what Luke says is land was approaching them. Now, that doesn't make sense to a landlubber's ear. That's why the translation sort of flips it so that it makes sense the way we probably would picture it. That is, the land's not moving, the ship is. So the ship is approaching, the land is not. But the primary way that they're going to begin to suspect that they're near shallow water, even in the dark, is going to be the sound. So we've talked about the waves changing. But when those monstrous storm waves begin to impact a shoreline, there is going to be a booming surf. It's going to be a tremendous low-frequency bass sound of those huge waves pounding against a coastline. And so when you get that kind of power, that kind of breaking surf, remember how well sound carries over water. Now, they're in a high wind situation. They're in a noisy environment, but the wind tends to be especially around masts and rigging of sailboats, a high-frequency, high-pitched sound. Storm gales or high winds are often described as sailors as a shrieking sound because of the vibration of the rigging, the ropes, the cables, etc., where a surf sound is that booming bass drum, low-frequency sound, one that you would pick out a difference, especially, of course, to an experienced ear. Well, the way Luke says that then, that the sense of the land is approaching him, well, that would be exactly right. The sound of the surf is coming to them. They're receiving the sound waves. It's a really interesting, accurate, and nautical way that Luke describes this experience. So as they're taking these soundings, and the way they do that, they don't have, today we would use sonar, which sends a sound wave down, it reflects back up. The little computer measures the difference with the speed of sound through water and then calculates the depth. What they have is a rope with an object on the end of it, and they're able to throw it out. And ropes, these lines are often marked, typically with knots. That's also how they could determine their speed, as far as letting it go behind them with some kind of drag type, small parachute type of thing where it would drag behind them, and they can count the knots in a certain amount of time, the knots going through their hand, which is where we suspect the term knots came from rather than miles per hour in terms of the sailor's language or vocabulary. So they would throw out this weight, and it would go down, and they would let it slide through their hands, and then when they get slack, they know that the weight has hit the bottom, catch that point, and then they're able to bring it back and measure that difference. So they are in relatively shallow water, especially if a boat needs somewhere around 20 feet of draft, 20 feet of water to float in, but you're in 40-foot waves, you're getting that doubled as the ship is rising and falling. So again, 120 feet is not very deep, and then it shallows rapidly for them. So we continue to read in verse 29, fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks or against rough ground. It says they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daylight. Where they went aground is the island of Malta, and it has a formidable coastline. Here's one of the photos from actual Malta today, and you can see this is not a tourist beach. This is not the Gulf of New Mexico. This is not sliding up on a beautiful Caribbean island. This is an island of rock, and the coastline is rugged and vicious. And so you wouldn't want to just bump into these kinds of rocks. And so not only can you see how dangerous this coastline is, but you can see where the waves have tremendous rock cliffs to slam into and make a lot of noise, and those rock cliffs would reflect that sound back out to sea. If it were a gently sloping, nice touristy sandy beach, then it wouldn't be near the impact of the waves slamming into something, and you wouldn't have that sound being reflected back out to sea. These types of coastlines will have a different sound to an experienced sailor's ear than a sandy, low, gentle, casual coastline would have. So they recognize that particular sound as one of great danger of these waves slamming into a rocky coastline, and that's where they're afraid of. So they put out 4 anchors from the stern. We've talked about the sea anchor, the parachute that would drag. Here, they don't want to drift. They want to get the ship stopped. Well, because they're in shallow enough water, now they're able to put out what you and I generally think of a traditional anchor. That is a huge metal hook is about what it amounts to, that goes down and gets a hold of the bottom. They're going to put out 4. So that tells us when they were casting the ship's tackle overboard, they didn't throw out everything. The captain would know in such a case that they were going to eventually arrive at some shoreline or some sandbar somewhere, and they would desperately need these anchors, even though they would be pretty heavy. They put out 4 of them. Well, for one reason, you definitely would need a backup, because if one were to break or to tear loose, then you would be in great peril, because they can hear those waves hitting something, but they can't see it. They're not sure how far it is. They don't know where they are, so they're not able to say, oh, well, it doesn't get any deeper than this. They just don't know. So you'd put out 2 anyway because you need the safety, but by putting out 4, and probably they would try to spread them out in a fan as far as they could apart from each other. What that would give them is, number 1, of course, the safety of multiple anchors holding them. Number 2, it would keep the ship from swinging, but keep it straight as the waves are coming now from the back. And then when it's time to let go, they can at least control a little bit the angle of their launch. If they cut the lines to the outer anchors and then cut the middle ones last, they're going to go straight on forward. If they were to cut all the lines except, let's say, the one on the port side, then the ship would swing to the port off that single anchor, and then you'd cut it, and you've got a running start at an angle. And then, of course, the opposite if they choose the far right or starboard anchor. So not only is there backup safety, security, and having 4, but it gives them, when daylight comes, a better option of how to launch, because they have very limited steering ability because they can't put up a lot of sail. They're still in tremendous waves, and so the controllability of the ship is still pretty limited. And so this gives them an option when it's time to launch. You see again the example of expert seamanship. These are experienced sailors and certainly an experienced captain. So they're going to put out these 4 anchors from the stern, which, because the danger's ahead of them, if they were to anchor from the bow and then the ship swing around, it would ride better, right, having the bow into the waves. That's how the ship's designed. But then when it's time to let go and make a run for the beach, the ship's pointed backwards, which means you'd have to spin it again, and that means you'd have to get broadside to the waves, which could be very tragic, and they could end up being just washed broadside onto whatever the obstacle is that they can hear, but they can't see. Even the fact of putting anchors out to the bow and allowing the ship to spin, get sideways in the water with these kinds of waves, is not a wise choice. So they've been driving to the west, they've been going that way, and so likely then what happens is they fan out these 4 anchors out off the stern, then they either cut loose from or they bring in that bow sea anchor and allows the ship to swing so she's pointed straight downwind. It's not great. It's the second best option. Bow on for most ships is the best way to survive huge waves. Broadside is lethal, so what's left is face downwind and allow the waves to break over the stern or the back. At least you don't have the whole side of the ship exposed for it to get rolled or to get pummeled. But still, this would be a long night. That's why I think the expression wished for daybreak is so heavy with dread and anticipation. Because it's not just, all right, well, let's just wait till daylight. Every wave is slamming into the back of that ship, and it's going to make the whole ship just shake. They've already got the cables around it. Water's going to wash up over the back and across the deck. It's not designed for the water to come this direction. Certainly sailing ships are designed with more tolerance for that than the average power boat or the ship propelled by propellers. They can't handle much at all from the stern. It's very blunt across the back if you look at most modern ship designs. So they're going to spend the rest of this night with these waves slamming against the ship, and it's shaking and shuddering every time it takes a blow, water pouring across the deck. They've got to be running a bucket brigade of just bailing water out of this thing, keeping it floating. And then the strain on those anchors, which is another reason to have 4, as the wave would pass and the ship slides off the back of the wave, there'd be a little slack on those lines, and then the next wave lifts the stern and tries to shove it forward and then slams into the back of it, and it's going to try to drive that ship forward. So you're talking about a really noisy, difficult environment. It may not have as much roll as it has had, but now it's got a whole lot of pitch movement and these waves slamming into the back of it. Verse 30 continues, as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship, they had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. So they're at the stern. They're going to lower down this little boat in the back again that they had hoisted up, and they're pretending like we're going to put more anchors off the bow, and they're going to make a run for the beach. Experienced sailors would have a decent chance in a small craft that they could control. They'll probably still lose it in the surf, but at least they can get close. So they're going to literally abandon ship with disregard, total disregard for all the lives that are there, which in total we learn in verse 37 is 276. They're abandoning a lot of people. Whether it's because the Lord has said to Paul that they will all get through it, they must run aground a certain island, whether it's Paul's own experience, he's sailed enough, he's been paying attention, he already knew that they really didn't need to travel. He understands that this is a ploy, that they are being deceived. And one of the things Paul may have known from experience, if you got 4 anchors off the back, what's the point in literally risking life and limb to get in a small boat in the pounding seas to go off the bow to put out anchors off the bow? What would be the point of that? So it's not very sailor-like to attempt this particular thing in terms of trying to hold the ship together. So Paul discerns that this is just a pretense. So in verse 31, he said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Again, it'd be interesting if Paul's coming from, look, we're going to need the sailors. That's we'll see in a few verses why, but also the idea that we all need to stay together. That's how the Lord has told him, which may be the simple way the Lord is giving Paul this awareness. Look, you all need to stay together, and not one of them will be lost, those that are with you, so let's stay together. Well, part of that is going to help Paul recognize, don't get separated from the sailors. They still have a very important need for the sailors and their experience and their ability. There's one more final maneuver that they need to perform with this ship. Well, so when the soldiers hear Paul, they're listening to him now, as they have with Paul's encouragement about that they will survive the storm. So the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall. And so they've lowered it. Well, now they cut the lines loose, and then the little craft is going to drift away and be lost. If you ever talk to a sailor, I did this one time. A man was working on a sailboat, and I walked along the dock, and I said, wow, that's really a nice sailboat, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, oh, are you working? And he had the lines in his hand. I said, oh, are you working on the rope? It's one of those, just people are funny about vocabulary when it gets to their particular interest. And so with a look of disdain, he said, I don't have any ropes on my boat. All I have is lines. Because for whatever reason, on a sailing ship, they're never, ever, 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 ever called ropes. They're lines. And so it's sort of funny that, again, landlubbers have translated this into English, and we're reading about ropes. If a sailor had translated this, it would be cut away the lines of the ship's boat. You would not see the word rope. So they cut the little boat loose. It drifts away. Verse 33. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating and having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. This storm has been so frightful and so violent and so powerful that they haven't eaten in 14 days. Now, as long as you can drink some water, and they've probably all they had to do is open their mouth. They've been in a raging typhoon. They've had all the water they can stand. They hadn't been dry in 2 weeks, for sure. So having not eaten with all the violence of the ship's movement and fear and all those things, that sort of would make sense. But Paul says, you need to eat. And a couple of things happen. One, if they're about to go swimming, because remember, Paul told them that we will all be spared, but the ship will be lost. Go back to verse 22. Paul says, yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And then he said in verse 26, we must run aground on a certain island. If they're about to go swimming, or if they're going to need to do anything very physical, which is about to happen, they need all the strength they can get. So number one, this is great common sense. Let's eat. You're going to need your strength. Secondly, there's something encouraging about eating. There's something normalizing about eating, that everything's okay. Because we don't eat when we're panicked, when we're stressed, when we're running, when we're frightened, when we're fighting. We don't eat. So to eat is to stop really everything else we're doing. So it's a moment of calm. It's a moment of peace. It's a moment of fellowship. Verse 35, then he sets the example. Verse 35 says, having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all. Now don't miss that. Don't read so fast that we don't see the beauty in what's happening. Paul thanks God for the food. Paul thanks God for his blessings. Paul thanks God for his provision on the deck of a heaving, shuddering ship that's being slammed by those great waves of a typhoon within sound, or being anchored within sound of a raging surf. I mean, there is everything about this scene, about the danger, about the discomfort, about we're all going to die, about why hasn't God saved us, or doesn't he care about us? Because they've been in this situation now for 2 weeks, 14 days, and Paul gives thanks. You see, he writes to the Thessalonians like give thanks in everything and always giving thanks. Paul tells us in the book of Romans also to give thanks. He mentions it numerous times in numerous letters, and here we show that it's something that he practices. It is in the giving of thanks that our spirit is encouraged, our mind is cleared, and our heart is given some calm. Because in the thanking of God is a surrender of our fears and of our plans. A thanking of God is a recognition that God is in control. He's the one that made this storm. He's the one that allowed the storm. He's the one that has allowed them to get where they are. And he's the one who's promised that they're going to be okay. So the giving of thanks is a powerful moment in a unique place among a sodden group on a creaking and groaning deck of a doomed ship. And Paul gives thanks. He gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and he began to eat. All of them were encouraged by his example, encouraged by the food, and encouraged by the prayer, the focus on God. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. It's a big meal, and it's a big moment. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. They don't need it anymore. There's something comforting and something final about this act. For when the day dawns, this voyage is over, one way or the other. Come what may. And of course, the promise of God is they're going to be okay. Now, he told them we'd run aground a certain island, and they are within sound of a surf and a beach. Verse 39 says, when the day came, they could not recognize the land. They don't know where they are. They've not had navigational guides for 2 weeks, but they did observe a bay with a beach. What's interesting on the Isle of Malta, again, the coastline is a rocky, hostile coastline. You saw the picture of the Great Cliffs. Here's the famous castle that faces to the southeast off of Malta. And you can see all around it a shoreline of rocks. To run up on this would be like to run up on a meat grinder. It will not only absolutely obliterate the ship, but also those that are on it. Here's another place on the Isle of Malta, and you see again this coastline. Not only is there the idea, if you come aground on one of these cliff areas, if you come aground here and these waves are shoving and slamming, you're going to get slammed into those rocks and literally broken up. Not just a ship, but your body. If you come aground or come ashore, if you will, against one of these areas that's more cliff-like, you'll never get out of the water. The water's going to slam you against those rocks. It's going to kill you, and even if you try to catch a hold of the rock, you start trying to climb up, but another wave comes and slams you and washes you back off. Where waves slam against a wall like that or a coast like that, there's a heavy undercurrent because that water's got to go back. It's not going to just literally stack up. So there's a vicious undercurrent coming back underneath as the waves slam and then it rolls back underneath. So it is an absolute nightmare. We can't imagine the sounds and the horror and the power that they are experiencing. So here's just one depiction of this ship that's been held by the 4 anchors here in the back. And now they see the rocks ahead of them. They see the shoreline ahead of them. So they don't recognize the land, but they do observe a bay with a beach, and they resolve to drive the ship onto it if they can. Right? So in this, all these rocks and these cliffs, they do see a beach. They have something to aim for. Now they're able to cut whichever of the anchors they need to get whatever starting angle. They're going to put the steering oar back in the water. They're going to have a small sail up front to give it some drive so they're not just drifting, they're actually moving forward. If they don't move forward through the water, the rudder has no ability to steer them. If they can't steer, they can't aim for the sandy beach. If they can't aim for the sandy beach, they're just going into the rocks, and they are not going to survive. So, verse 40, casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, which means they'd just cut them, because there's no need to try to hold on to the anchors. There'd be no ability. Normally, to pick up an anchor that's been dug in from such strain at that angle, they would have to go the opposite direction, sail over the anchor, and then pry it loose from the opposite direction. Well, they're not going upwind. They're not going into the waves. They're just going to drift. So they would have taken an axe or hatchet-like tool and just cut the lines in the order that gave them the best angle and make a run for it. While they're doing that, it says in verse 40, they left him in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders to get those down and get them to steer. And they're hoisting the foresail to the wind, so downwind, they were headed for the beach. That's why they still needed the sailors. The soldiers would not have known how to do that. They wouldn't have known the timing of that. You know, you don't want to get the foresail up too soon, but neither do you want to get it up too late. So you want to get those anchors cut loose, get those rudders in the water, and get that sail unfurled and open and catch the wind and start moving the ship forward with forward velocity so they can steer. All that would take a lot of doing in a pitching, noisy, crashing environment that they are in. However, so there is an interesting place on the Isle of Malta, and it's called the Bay of St. Paul. And there's a pretty good feel that they believe this is probably where the Apostle Paul's ship went aground, in a place called Salina Bay, because it faces back to the east, and it is one of the few sandy beaches in that rocky coastline on that side of the island. So it's very likely this is exactly what they were seeing. They could see all these rocks and imagine them white with the water just crashing against them and the slamming and the booming surf. And then you see a low spot in the waves because they're rolling up on a shallower coastline. And then you see the welcome sign of the sandy beach versus the rocks. So that's what they aim for, and off they go. However, in verse 41, they struck a reef, or they struck a low place, a sandbar. They struck some rocks in verse 41, a shallow place. But striking a reef where two seas meet, this is another point about this bay. As the waves slam against that side, there's a reverb where the current will come together in the middle of the bay as it goes back out. And so where those waves are coming together, there's a shallow place, and that's where the ship strikes. As they strike into this spot, verse 41 says, they ran the vessel aground, or into the ground, or into the bottom, and the prow, or the bow, or the front of the ship stuck fast and remained immovable. They would have hit that with great force, and as the wave is picking up the ship, it'd slam it in, and then it would let the ship down. The next wave might pick it up just a little bit, and then a little bit further, and then once that's done, it's stuck. The waves aren't going to be able to pick it up anymore, and it is stuck, jammed into the bottom. However, the stern is still floating. It hasn't gotten to that obstacle, and those waves are now slamming into that ship. When it was anchored, the whole ship could bob and rise and give to that force, but now that it's stuck against hard ground, the ship's not floating anymore. It can't respond, or at least the front half isn't floating. The back's trying to. And so now the waves are slamming against an immovable object. The stern, or the back of the boat, is more blunt. It is made out of wood, and thousands, literally tons of weight of water is falling on that ship and slamming against that ship. So we read, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. They were aiming for this sandy beach. It'd be a good place to get to because once they get there, they've got these nice resort condos where they can relax. Well, obviously, that wasn't there. Trying to get an image of what this would have been like, the violence of this ship getting close. And even though it's close, there's still plenty of opportunity to drown, that those waves are still powerful and slamming against them. Perhaps this might be an even better image where the ship is splintering apart. It's breaking in two. The front half is stuck. The back half is being broken away. There's those cliffs and those rocks. And here's this beach they were trying to get to, but now the ship has run aground before they got to it, just like Paul said. Verse 42, the soldiers' plan was to kill them, to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. That's Rome's policy. If the guards lose anybody, their life is taken in forfeit. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention. Because once they start killing prisoners, Paul could very easily get caught up in that as well. So the centurion commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first. They're close, and swimmers, if you can keep your head out of water, if you can let the waves push you, and again, do the same thing you're trying to do with the ship, swim for the beach. Because the current's still rolling and pushing and slamming against the sides and those rocks. So it'll take some pretty good swimming to stay on course and not get swept into those areas against the rocks. So those that could swim jump overboard first, which wasn't that common. Swimming is kind of a modern phenomenon. A lot of folks, and what's really interesting is the average sailor, at least in the 1800s, couldn't swim. And so not having a life jacket, not having a lifeboat, not being able to swim, it was an interesting... I guess you'd stay committed to operating the ship because you don't have a lot of options. Those that could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship, things they could grab and get off, but also the ship's coming apart. So as you jump in the water, now there's all kind of floating debris, which is helpful if you can stay on top of it. It's not helpful. Remember, the crashing waves and all this debris and boards and masts and barrels and things are lifting, so you can also get slammed with debris. So you're going to have to crawl and clamber and hold on and try to stay on top of whatever that debris is that's getting washed and churned and mixed and stirred as it's getting shoved toward the beach. So chapter 27 ends, and so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. Exactly what God said would happen. They have gone 14 days without eating. They've only had one meal just that morning, just recently. They have been soaked in cold for weeks. They have had the terror and adrenaline of getting off the ship as it's breaking apart. They have swam for their lives. They have kicked and pulled and climbed and held on in the crashing waves and have finally waded exhausted to the beach to finally stagger out of the surf, even as they let go of their boards and barrels and other things and trying to wade. But then you're going to have huge waves still slamming up on the beach, knocking you down, dragging you around. If it's not a perfect sandy beach, there's other things to fall on or get hurt by, etc. And then you finally get above the reach of the water and just collapse. Wet, cold, and exhausted. Interestingly enough, in the very next chapter, they will be shown tremendous hospitality. Those that live on the island will make a fire for them and help them be warm. And on Paul's way to Rome, in his all-expense-paid cruise, paid by Rome, he will experience a shipwreck. What an interesting delay. What an interesting coincidence. They would end up on Malta, of all places. They could have been anywhere in the Mediterranean because of that storm. They end up at Malta. And because they end up at Malta, shipwrecked, what God is going to do through Paul in the next chapter will bring about even more believers. God knew there were receptive hearts on a strange little rocky island that needed to hear the gospel. Why not have Paul stop by and have a little visit? on his way to Rome. The stopping by was quite an adventure, but that's exactly what God is going to accomplish. And so we'll pick that up, God's amazing work through the faith of the Apostle Paul, in the very next chapter.
The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He